Episode 62. Hello, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff, and I'll be your host as we listen to eyewitness encounters involving one of the most terrifying cryptids, Dogmen. Our guest tonight is Paul Sinclair. Paul, welcome to Dogman Encounters Radio. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Vic, and it's a pleasure to be here and be able to speak to you.
Oh, it's great to have you. Paul, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, as you already know, Vic, I'm aged 52 years old, and I live here in the UK in a small fishing town called Bridlington. I'm a married man, married for 33 years. I have 4 girls. I've always been an outdoor type of person. Spent lots of my youth around farms and been brought up in villages around small communities. Always had an outdoor kind of interesting kind of person. That's the way I am. The place we're talking about tonight, Flixton, is 9 miles from where I live. I live on the edge of the North Sea at Bridlington, as I said, which is a coastal community. I'm a joiner by trade, so obviously it's all hands-on with me. Unlike most of the people you interview, I'm not into hunting as such because we don't have access to guns and huge expanses of land to hunt on here in the UK like you do where you are, but nevertheless, I would think I'm quite an outdoor kind of man. I hope that tells you a little bit about me.
It sure does. That's a good bio. Since you're here to talk about the Flixton Werewolf, Paul, please set the table by telling us about the village of Flixton.
Yeah, well, it's a very, very small village, is Flixton. Its neighbour village is Folketon. You could hardly tell the two apart. You have the signpost coming into Flixton. On the opposite side of the signpost, you've got the name of Folketon. That's how close they are. And if they were merged, it would still be a small village. It's a very small community. Very old, probably one of the oldest villages in England, if truth be known. Well, it is. It has lots and lots of ancient historic features, including Flixton Star Car, which is a Mesolithic site of great archaeological importance. The villages around it are equally as interesting, really. 4 miles away, you've got the village of Hunmanby, which we might come to later in the story because it does feature. Just out of Flixton, you've got another village called Staxton. So initially, you've got Folketon at one end, Flixton in the middle, Staxton, and then a little further, you've got a small village called Binnington. So all these small communities, which would have been even smaller many years ago, are in very close proximity. And below Flixton, you've got another slightly larger than a village called Seamer, and that is in the valley of the Flixton Star Car, which are the Car meaning wetlands. If none of anybody didn't know that, so that's a rough idea of the area.
It does sound like an area that's very rich in history. I can only imagine how far back that goes. Before I have you share all of these encounters people in the area have had, stretching way back with the werewolf of Flixton, I want to ask you, in the pre-interview you mentioned that the forests in that area are very scary looking. Could you tell us why they look so scary? What is it about the forests in that area that are so frightening?
Well, I suppose until I actually started looking into the accounts of the Flixton Werewolf, I'd never really looked into these areas of woodland. The particular area of Flixton and Staxton, which is called Flixton Wold and Staxton Wold. I feel now I need to explain what the wolds are. A wold is an area of predominantly chalkland that is covered in grass for grazing cattle, woodland, and then further up towards the north we've got the moors. But that is a wold. Well, Flixton Wold and Staxton Wold are on particularly steep elevations. So the woodland around that area is, It's quite dense woodland, but because it's on such an angle, probably 45-degree angle, and the trees are quite mature and tall, even though they're growing in what is not ideal fertile soil, because it's predominantly chalk, the roots are on the surface. So you've got these quite large trees that are growing on a 45-degree angle with roots that look like snakes wriggling down along the woodland. It's quite eerie, especially as it gets a little bit darker. I know that only adds to the flavour of the place and probably adds to the stories that I'm telling. But it's not a nice feeling, actually, when you get up there late on or after dark. And maybe I'm a bit foolhardy for going up there after dark, but there you go.
It sounds like it would be a pretty creepy place to go to after the sun goes down. For anyone that's wondering what this place looks like, Paul is going to send me some pictures that I'm going to post on the YouTube version of the show. If you want to get an idea of what the area looks like, check out the YouTube version of the show and you'll be able to see. Moving forward, Paul, you've got a number of encounters to tell us about that have occurred in that area. If you don't mind, please start with the earliest one and take it forward from there.
Okay then, Vic. There's a number of encounters that obviously I've not personally looked into. I mean, I'd have had to be about 500 or 600 years old to look into them, bearing in mind that this story goes back to the 10th century. So it's a very old story, the accounts of the Flixton Werewolf. But in the 16th century, there is an account of it attacking a coach and horses. Skeptics have tried to discredit this by saying it would have just been a wolf. And it could well be true, but it's one lone animal that's said to have attacked a coach and horses and its occupants inside. So I can't verify whether there's truth in that. Obviously, anyone listening to me would understand that, but that is an early account. Other accounts follow throughout the years, right up to present day. Now, I've spoken to people in Flixton and Folkestone, because we have to consider Folkestone because it's so close, about this alleged Flixton werewolf. Maybe the word alleged I shouldn't use, because I actually believe that this thing is real. I really do. Whether it's flesh and blood or something else, I actually believe it's real. I have no reason to believe that the people who've told me these things have any other reason to tell me than just to get these things off their chest. Before I go into the accounts, Vic, I perhaps ought to say that one of the men who told me two of the accounts lives in Flixton. Well, I spoke to him a few years ago, and he said he knew nothing about this story. As I looked into it and found out more information and sort of dug and looked deeper, I don't want to go too much into the history of it, but one day I spoke to this guy, probably after a 6-month period, and I told him I found out that Flixton used to be known as Wolfland, which is true. It can be there, it can be found, so it's not just my word, it's not just relaying a message, it's actually true. So once he knew I'd found this out and he knew I were digging, he told me that he did know of the stories, and that his father knew of them, and his grandfather knew them, and his grandfather before that. What he actually said was, if you've lived in Flixton for 40 years, you are not a local. He said his family personally went back over 5 generations. That is how deep this story goes, and trying to get accounts. It's took me years to get these few accounts out of people. He thinks that there was between 5 and 10 people that would actually be able to tell me about the Flixton werewolf. They just called it the beast, to be honest. They didn't call it the Flixton werewolf. I think that's been added by writers from the UK over the last probably 10 to 20 years. However, he's quite confident in his mind, at 78 years of age, that this thing exists in whatever way, shape or form it is. It is real, and I actually believe him. But it's took me so long to get these bits of information out of these people. So, Vic, would you like me to tell you about the first account that I've got?
Please do.
Okay, right. Well, once again, people listening, these are historic accounts, and this one goes back to 1948, approximately. On top of Flixton Wold, there is a series of large round barrows. It's an ancient barrow cemetery, burial mounds. That's what a barrow is, or what we term as a barrow. And there's 7, and they're called Sharp How. Now, this chap told me that as a young boy, I'm not going to say his name, but he's now 78, so I think you can derive who's told me. And he was aged 11, or around that age. He was at Sharp Howe one late summer with another boy. He said they could do what they wanted, basically. The farming folk and none of the dangers of letting your children out playing. Well, we say that, and we're talking about the Flixton Werewolf. But in them days, none what we'd associate anyway. So they're up at Sharp Howe, and they're just doing what young boys do, just playing as you do, and they noticed there's a large tree growing out of the side of Sharp Howe, or one of the burial mounds. And there's this thing crouched on its haunches with its back to the tree. And they're looking at it, trying to decipher just what it is. They don't know. It's hairy. It's muscular. It's the size of a man, if not larger, because I did ask its size, and they thought it were like a big man. So I'm not going to say it were 8 foot tall, because this thing's on its haunches, and they didn't know, really, and the young boys. They said it was looking at something in its hands. Now, he didn't say it had hands like a man. He said it had fingers, and it was studying something. Whatever it was studying was in both hands, and its head was down, looking at it. And as they're observing this, with ears like a dog as well, by the way, its head just slowly lifted and looked at them. They were horrified. This, they described, was a man covered in hair with a dog's head. And it wasn't night time. It didn't display any glowing red eyes. It terrified them. They turned and they ran. They never looked back. It didn't chase them. It didn't growl at them, or they felt overcome with fear, as I should imagine anybody would. But that is his story that he relayed to me, and that took me a few years to get out of him. I'd like to move forward to approximately 1967. What we've got here, I live in Bridlington, which is, as I've previously discussed, a small seaside town fishing community. Just down the coast from me, probably 9 miles, is another village, another fishing community called Filey. And that runs parallel, if you went inland, to Flixton. Now, these two chaps in 1967 had been for a night out in Filey, as most young men would probably do in any town, any place in the world. They're coming home late at night. I don't have a time, but it's late. I don't have a month even. It's late at night, and they're on, this road features in many of the accounts, they're on the A1039. And they're on a motorbike, so obviously one riding, one pillion. And what they saw on the A1039 entering the village of Flixton, in the bottom of a dyke, just sort of coming out of the dyke, is, I would imagine, I mean, we're on talking about dogmen, but in them days they never talked that kind of language or that terminology, but that's what they saw. It had glowing red eyes, it was full of hair, and it was a man coming out of the dyke with a dog's head. We don't have wolves in the UK. We don't have bears in the UK. We have deer. They tell me that this, for all intents and purposes, was a man with a dog's head covered in hair, muscly. Didn't attack them, once again, didn't attack them. It was coming out of the dyke. As they approached it, they caught it in the headlights and they saw it. Now, they'd stuck to that story. Old men. I'm 52, so not young, but much older than me. They've held on to that story, and once again, Vic, I can find no reason, really. They could be lying, but why would they? I mean, why would anybody come out with this stuff? You know, I mean, I just don't understand it. There's got to be some kind of truth into these accounts that you're being told and the ones that I'm telling you now. So then, if we can end with that one, I'm sorry these accounts are short, listeners, but it's been difficult getting these. Below Flixton is an area of flat land called Seamer, and it's just past the Flixton Cars. If I haven't already told you, the car means area of wetland, reeds and elder. Flixton Star Car, the archaeological site. So we've got a farmer who was working on the cars. He'd been to tend to his livestock and his coming home after a day's work. It's no good me trying to say what he's been doing, because once again, I've got this story. There's a lot of drainage ditches on the Flixton cars, because, like we said, it is wetland. And he's walking along what's known as the Seamer Drain. And as he's walking along, he arrives at a gate which is quite tall. It's night time. There's a sneck or a latch at the top of the gate, and he has to reach over or put his hand high to release this latch. And when he does, he swears that a clawed hand, not paw, a clawed hand, fingers hairy with claws, clasped over the top of his hand as he tried to get the gate undone, which terrified him. He didn't see a dogman, he didn't see a wolfman, he didn't see anything apart from that, nothing else. So that is the only sort of information I've got on that account, and I was told that account by a chap who used to work at the Flixton sawmill, who's quite knowledgeable, to be honest with you. We'll probably touch on that in a minute.
Before you do move on with any of the other encounters, I want to make a point here, Paul. A man's word meant everything back then. If you didn't have a good reputation for honesty and character back then you really didn't have anything. People were much less likely to tell lies like that for fear of damaging that rep.
This is very true, Vic, and I actually believe that this is part of the reason these stories have remained hidden for so long. If I can just sort of move away from Flixton Werewolf for a moment, my main interest is UFOs and other unexplained things, big cats, things of that nature. And I look quite deep into these things, and it's whilst looking into these that the Flixton Werewolf story kept cropping up. Whilst doing a bit of research, I decided I would have a look into this. I actually thought that I wouldn't be looking into it long. I don't mean to disrespect anybody who's previously spoken to you, because full credit to them, there's some fabulous accounts, but I actually didn't think that I'd be finding much, but I'm absolutely amazed by what I've found. So if I could move on to this other account, Vic, is that okay?
Please do.
Yeah, well, what we've got then is an account from the 1970s. Now, I'd like to stress that this one is not my own. It's a lot of people's, because it's featured in quite a lot of books, but it seems unfair not to put it in amongst these. And this report is of a huge dog-like man attacking a timber wagon, once again, on the A1039 road. It's supposed to have left physical marks on the timber wagon and left the driver absolutely terrified. I can only find the information on the internet, and it is in one book that I've managed to purchase. However, to support this, the people in Flixton and Fulton that I've spoke to who've been willing to talk about the Flixton Werewolf do remember it, which sort of adds a little more weight to the story. It perhaps would have been better if at the time that had come forward and said, but that is the nature of these unusual accounts and encounters. So, as I say, that is in the 1970s. It's reported to be attacking a timber wagon. So, once again, I find myself thinking, what is this thing? Is it flesh and blood? And I'm questioning it because I've listened to your reports, Vic, and the good people that have given accounts to you say that they've shot at this creature and it's had no impact on them. So I'm thinking, is it some kind of apparition, shape-shifting creature, or I don't really know. I'm thinking it can't be flesh and blood, but then I contradict myself because it's attacked a timber wagon and left traces. So I don't know what we're dealing with. So if I can move from there, we've got another account then, once again, of a huge wolf-like creature with glowing red eyes. This one's one of my own that I've managed to get, that was seen chasing terrified cows across a field just out of Flixton and Staxton in the village of Binnington. Now, they said it had red eyes and glowing red eyes, but it was seen in daylight. So I'm not sure how that works, but I'm not sure how any of this works. And who are we to sort of say it can't. I mean, things are happening with these things that are just beyond our comprehension, I feel. Now, there's no reports of this creature actually killing the cows. It chased them into a ditch or a ravine, and I'm told that they had to be destroyed. The cows died as a result of it. Now, that was in the 1970s. Two people have told me about this. One of them told me about it, who actually was a schoolboy at the time. I know things can run wild in school children's minds, but one of them was a grown man, one was a schoolboy, and the schoolboy said that's what all they talked about in their small school for a few weeks. But if we can move on from there, there's another account of a group of young boys who were playing around Flixton and Staxton Wold, and they saw on the edge of the woods what they described as a very, very large black dog. But they couldn't decide, they couldn't sort of work out what it was. They watched it for quite a while, and one of the boys ran to his auntie's and got some binoculars, and it was still there. And they couldn't work out whether it had got a cat's head or a dog's head, and they called it a dog cat. Now, this is 1985. I probably didn't say that, so I apologise. So that is all I've got of that creature. It sounds very peculiar, but once again, what isn't peculiar about this Flixton Werewolf sightings and accounts, and what you're seeing at your end of the world, Vic?
Yeah, everything about this topic is very hard to figure, but when you mentioned earlier about the hunters who had shot one of these things without any effects that you would expect to see, Larry Parker mentioned shooting one in the chest with a 30-06 in episode 21, I believe. Yeah, episode 21. It didn't drop like you would expect it to drop if anything that size got hit center mass by a 30-06 bullet. There are so many things they do that are hard to figure that it's hard to say anything about them with certainty.
This is true, Vic, and I've listened to lots of the accounts that these good people have shared with you on your station now. It's captured me. I've become intrigued with it, to be honest with you, and I don't know what we're dealing with. I mean, could it be actually interdimensional? If that's not too hard for your listeners to get their heads around, and I'm not trying to be patronising, but, you know, I sometimes think, after we've explored all the logical answers, then sometimes we have to actually consider the illogical. People at your side of the world have access to guns and lots of sort of different ammo, and they know what they're doing, and when it comes to hunting, they can sort of weigh their prey up and the size and what they would need to bring that animal down. And bullets are having no effect on this. So, or in many cases, should I say, I can't say in all cases, in many cases having no effect on this. So it's definitely something different to the norm. So even if it is in our physical as we see it, it's a difficult one. I'm struggling to even find the words to say what I want to say, Vic.
Oh, I can relate. It's really hard to put a finger on a lot of the things they do.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, I do have another account, Vic, from 2013. And once again, the road, the A1039 features. Now, before I go into it, the A1039 road is nothing exotic. It just runs parallel with all of these villages. Staxton, Flixton, it takes you to Hummonby, it takes you to Filey, where them guys who encountered the werewolf coming home from a night out. And to the right of the road, you look up onto Flixton Wold, Staxton Wold, all the heavily wooded areas where this thing, let's assume it's flesh and blood, where this thing must spend quite a bit of time. Although many areas around North and East Yorkshire are so unpopulated that it wouldn't really have to touch population to move from one area to another. So this account took place in 2013, and it involved a man walking two dogs towards Flixton Wold. Flixton and Staxton Wold, the two merge. He's walking his two dogs, which are quite sharp and alert, and he tells me that they love to chase pheasants and rabbits and basically do what dogs do, and they'll chase after anything. The dogs became aware of something high up on the hillside, about 400 yards away. What we'd got is, I don't know, a 12 to 18 inch grass and grazing for sheep. And then 400 yards away, 3-bar wooden fence, and Flixton and Staxton Wold beyond that. And his dogs, they froze rigid and they fixed their eyes on something further up the hill. What he couldn't understand was he didn't think the dogs would have been able to see it due to the height of the grass. So he's not sure if they sensed it or saw it. I thought I'd just throw that in because it might be interesting to some people. I don't know. But when he looks, he can see what he thought was a small pony on the edge of the forest on his side of the 3-bar fence. He's observing it and trying to work out what it is, and he's confused. His dogs don't want to go and investigate because that's the kind of thing that they liked to do. The next thing he knows, to his horror, it's got up on 2 legs and it's running down the field towards him, and it's a dog. Or what do we describe it as? It's a man with a dog's head running down the field towards him. He's horrified. He sort of drags his dogs on the leads. Well, I'm assuming they're on the leads. That's something I never asked. But he gets himself and the dogs out of the single track road that leads up to Flixton Wold onto the road, which is the A1039. And as he's doing that, a car comes down the road. This is early morning, but it's not dark. And he doesn't know whether the car stopped it or whether it just decided to stop by itself. But it just turned in a circle and went back up into the woods and disappeared. Now, that is all I know about that story. I can tell you that it's very close to what is known as Spittle Farm. There's a stream running close to it, Spittle Brook as it's known as, and Spittle Farm houses stands on what was once a refuge to protect travellers in the 10th century. We might touch on that later. If not, I'll speak to Vic about it when he wants to. If I can move on from that and take us to April 2014, we have to come at 9 to 10 miles away from Flixton to a location called Danes Dyke near Flamborough and Bempton. Danes Dyke is an interesting place in itself. It's an ancient earthworks where the Vikings are said to have tried to cut off the mainland from what would be Bridlington, where I live, and Flamborough, and separate it. Whether that's what happened in ancient history, I suppose we'll never know. But it's a huge ancient earthwork. It's got many stories attached to it, and probably equally as interesting as this. But this is a werewolf account from Danes Dyke at April 2014. Now, what happened there is this chap had been working on nights at a nearby industrial site at a place called Bessingby, just out of Bridlington. I don't know whether he was a regular shift worker, but he was coming home on night, probably alternated his shifts. But this particular night, Danes Dyke's in a hollow, I need to say that. He approached the hollow of Danes Dyke. It's a single track road that leads you into Flamborough and then on to Bempton. And as he approached the hollow and sort of his car just dipped into the hollow, his headlights caught the glint of eyes. And I think he thought it were a deer, because Danes Dyke, we do have roe deer, and we've got muntjac deer. If I pronounced that wrong, I apologise. It'd be about 200 yards down into the bottom of the hollow. So as he's driving down in between 3 and 3:30 in the morning, to his horror, on the right-hand side, crouched on all fours, is what he described as the creature from the American Werewolf in London. Now, I've not personally seen that film, so I was told that it was like it was when it was on the carpet. So anyone who's seen it, they'll have to... You can see it, I can't, and that is the truth. I've not seen the film. He says it was horrifying. It didn't attack him or attack the car. It was just looking, and it was on all fours. He says it was just horrifying. He continued home to Flamborough. His usual night entrance into the home consisted of sort of, I don't know, coming home, maybe having a drink, tea, coffee, and then getting ready and going to bed. But on this evening, he woke his wife up, frightened, having to tell his wife about what he'd seen, told her what it looked like, which is what I've just described to you, and basically that is the story. And now I'm never going to get any more about that out of these people. I just know I'm not, because that's end of it. I know it is. They don't want to talk about it, and maybe that's what you're talking about, Vic, when somebody's seen something like this and it has such a profound effect on them that it's maybe a bit foolhardy to find yourself on Flixton Werewolf, which is what I've done, I'll not deny it, in the night, looking for such things.
Well, I'm glad you have an appreciation for the risk that you're putting yourself in. Once you have a close-up and personal with one of these things, you'll definitely never be the same after it. Are you aware of the fact that all over the UK, other people are reporting having Dogman encounters? This isn't a phenomenon that's just local to the Flixton area.
Vic, I have to tell you, no, I'm not. Not at all. In a way, I don't mean I'm pleased, but it's enlightening, let's put it that way. Like I said to you before, my subject is UFOs, and I got into this, if I can tell you without hijacking your question, because I'm researching for a book, which I'm going to call The Truth That Leaves No Proof. It's about strange events around Bempton and Flamborough, within a 25-mile radius. Obviously, Flixton comes into that 25-mile radius. When I actually started researching the big cats, because there's quite a lot seen, and as you will be aware, we have no native big cats in this country, I started finding little stories or discovering little stories about this Flixton Werewolf. And I'll be quite honest, I really didn't think it would go very far. But the deeper I looked, the more I found. It's almost like looking down a tree with hollow branches, with little bits shooting off in all directions. Everywhere's dark, but there's a little grain of truth in everything. So yeah, enlighten me, Vic, because I am interested.
You had said certain things that left me with the impression that you thought that was basically only happening in that area, but no, in fact, like I said earlier, there are people all over the UK who are reporting encounters with these things. Here's an interesting tidbit for you. You said that you haven't seen An American Werewolf in London. That film was released in '81. There's a pub at the start of that movie called The Silent Lamb, where two hitchhikers / sightseeing tourists go for a beer after a long day's walk. This Silent Lamb pub is supposed to be right on the edge of the moors. The location for that pub was actually in the Black Mountains. What's ironic about all this is, to this day, people are reporting seeing dogman-like creatures in the Black Mountains. So, yeah, if you didn't know that, I figured that would be an interesting tidbit for you.
It's very interesting, and the fact that you're telling me that there's lots more people reporting these things here in the UK. I've listened to quite a few of your radio interviews, and I have listened to a few people in the UK, and the guy from Scotland who saw the creature as a young boy, looking at him from round a tree. Amazing, but I must be naive. I didn't realise that there were so many people in the UK looking into it, but probably that is part due to the fact that it's only sort of a side subject to what I'm really researching, Vic, you know, but nevertheless, this thing, I really do throw full respect to your listeners, because I might be saying things they don't want to hear. This thing, be it flesh and blood or something else, is real.
I'm not surprised that all these encounters have happened over in the UK and you didn't know about them. If you think people over here on this side of the pond are reluctant to talk about their encounters publicly, it's even harder to find anyone on that side of the pond who is interested in coming out publicly and sharing it.
This is very true, Vic. If we can just go back to the encounter that the two young boys had on Sharp How, you know, the ancient burial mounds. They were 11-year-old boys. I suppose they've told other people about, he has, the other one's died, I've got to say, told other people, or they told other people about what they saw as 11-year-old boys and throughout that time. But they never ever went public with it, and I think going public would be telling somebody who they would consider as an outsider like myself. Now, I've got respect, and I will not give any names away. It's such a small place, and it wouldn't be fair. But that took these men in the 70s and 80s all that time to share that little bit of a story with me. when they've gone, that's end of it. I mean, I hope there's a few more stories of the Flixton Werewolf, but well, I've got one now actually from last month. But I'm on about the historic ones. When these people, these men and women have passed away, that is the last we're going to get of these stories. That's why I think it's so important to document them, even though they are historic. I realise that at your side of the world, you've got people seeing these things on a much more regular basis. But bear in mind, we're in a country the size of a postage stamp compared to yourselves, and the areas of land that people have got to look in and these creatures have got to lose themselves in is vast compared to what we've got. I mean, I don't know what we're dealing with here. If it's a living, breathing thing, then we must be dealing with some kind of population, but where would it live? It must be a small population, I feel. My gut feeling is, and I do believe these things, regardless of whether other people don't, is that we're dealing with something that isn't flesh and blood. It may have the ability to enter our reality or our sphere of reality from time to time and even be physical. But I don't think it's always in our reality. Like I said previously, that might be a step too far for some people and they might think I'm a bit wacko. But once again, if we've explored all the rational possibilities and we're left with the irrational, then it has to be considered. That is the only thing in my defence when discussing this creature, because full respect to your people and the people that have seen it in this country, it's real. I just don't know what it is. So, if you want, Vic, I'll move to this last account that I've got from last month.
Please do.
Okay, well, this account sort of confirmed everything that everyone's told me, simply because I know the person that's seen it. This is what makes it so uncanny. I'm not going to say who it is, but I know them, and they wouldn't make a story up to impress Paul Sinclair, I assure you. Now, this lady is 33 years old. She's married, and she's got 2 children. And last month, I think it was on the blue moon. And now, I'm sure many of your listeners will know what a blue moon is, and I think it's when you have 2 full moons in the same month. If I'm wrong, someone please correct me. But it was on the blue moon, and they were travelling home from York, here in the UK. They'd had a day's shopping. They've got 2 young children, 8-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl, and they were travelling back home from York. They took the children to see some film at cinema last off, and then they were on the way back. Approximately 11 p.m, they're on, once again, the A1039. I know I have to keep saying this road, but I suppose it features in many of the accounts. And they're travelling down A1039. They've just passed Staxton to their right. The top of Staxton Wold, before we go into this story, I need to tell you that is RAF Staxton Wold, which is the oldest operational RAF base in the world. It's fully manned and still fully operational. It plays a major part in UK's and America's defence, I would have thought. But so they've just passed Staxton and they're approaching Flixton. And they're approaching the Roundabout, which on the left-hand side sits Spittal Farm, where the refuge was built to protect travellers in the 10th century. The Roundabout is quite large. It's got large mature sycamore trees growing in the centre of it. I think it's got about 11 mature sycamore trees, tall grass and ferns growing around it. As they're approaching this island, and it's lit up, bear in mind, but they're approaching the little village of Flixton, and there's not a lot of traffic on road, in fact, nothing. This lady sees something on the island, in between, like an arrowed direction sign, and to the right of it, a sign that tells you the location of an area. And there's a good, 15 foot in between them signs, and I know there is because we've sort of done his homework and looked at it, and this sign is over 4 foot tall, the arrowed sign. And she becomes aware, she gets a full side view of a large, huge, dark coloured, she says it was a dog, but we're talking pony-sized dog. They have a female Alsatian. It's your average-sized Alsatian dog. She says it was 4 times bigger than Dell. It was huge. The children were asleep in the back of the car. She said she was speechless, absolutely didn't know what to say. She knew immediately that she'd seen what I'd been talking about and looking into. She's watching it and looking at it. She'd got a full side view of this thing, and it was slightly taller at the shoulder than it was at the back, sort of hyena-like, if that sort of makes sense, but it had a very long curving tail, a shaggy curving tail that went down to the ground, and a long snout. She said it was muscular, with a deep rib cage, like a greyhound's rib cage, but more muscular. And even though it had got shaggy fur, she could tell it was very muscular. She just looked at it as they went round the roundabout and onto the road that would lead them to their house at Caton. Caton's just outside of Flixton, Seamer and Folketon. That's another little village. She immediately said to her husband, "Stop the car." She sort of gathered her senses. He asked her what the problem was. She says, "Are the doors locked?" He said they were. I'm sorry if I sound boring with this conversation, listeners, but I can only tell you what I've been told. She said, "I think I've just seen," and she said, "what I've been talking about," and he sort of chuckled. He thought she were joking. Anyway, I don't know, a few seconds later he realised that she weren't joking, and they were back on the road, and they did a few circuits of the roundabout to see whether they could see this thing, and there was nothing. Now, I've listened to all the stories of the Flixton Werewolf over the years. I've interviewed quite a few people about it during my sort of bits of research. I've had no reason to disbelieve any of the people, but this lady, I know, is telling the truth. We have since spent a bit of time with other people as well, a group of us, on Flixton Wold. Now, after listening to Vic's interviews with various other people, I think we're probably being a bit foolhardy. I mean, although there's been no reported deaths that I know of here in the UK, I mean, Vic might correct me, I still think that on reflection we've been a little bit silly entering Flixton Wold in the night. I go up there with cameras, I go all over. A lot of local farmers know me due to my interest in UFOs and they'll contact me if anything's been seen. So that's part of the reason we go up there. But on reflection, I think I need to rethink this. So that was the last account, Vic, that I've got, and I hope somebody's maybe found it interesting.
Oh, I can't see how they could not. Is that eyewitness the one who seemingly had the strongest reaction when recounting that encounter to you?
Without a doubt. Apart from, perhaps, the dog walker. The dog walker was shook up by the thing that got up on two legs and ran down the field towards him.
Well, that's totally expected. If you encounter something like that, especially something that looks that way that runs straight towards you, I can't see how that wouldn't affect you that way.
What is interesting, Vic, which I've probably never touched on, but I'll try and post some pictures to you, Vic, so that people can get an idea of what I'm on about. Where the dog walker was is perhaps, let me just get perhaps 200 yards from that roundabout. He was approaching Flixton Wold and Staxton Wold, and he'd have been going on a single-track road at the other side of the road 200 yards up from that roundabout. And the roundabout, as I spoke before, is on the corner where the farmhouse stands now, that stands on the ruins of the building that was built originally for protection of travellers in the 10th century.
I know you're pressed for time tonight. It is late over on your side of the pond. I am looking forward to having you back next week. I already asked Paul about that, and he agreed to come back to talk about some more very interesting topics. But while I've got you here tonight, before we close the show out, I've got a couple more questions for you, Paul. The first one would be, how do locals who haven't seen it in that area view the phenomenon?
I get a mixed reaction. When I first went to Flixton and Folketon, the two are inseparable, they're that close together. Most of the locals just looked at me as though I were an alien. One guy that I spoke to was working on the old blacksmith shop for his son. He was restoring the property, seen me and my wife actually walking around the village, and sort of, I don't know, he maybe took an interest in us and ended up speaking. And I told him what I was researching. He laughed openly in my face. Not sarcastically, it just come as such a shock to him. And then he said to me, "But I do know a guy that might know about this." Now that same man, Vic, first of all, we went to this chap's house, and he sort of knocked on the door, opened it, shouted his name. We all entered this guy's house, and he wasn't in, that's what this place is like. I don't want to open it up to burglars, but I mean, I couldn't believe it myself. Oh, he's not home. I later got to speak to him, and he'd never heard of the Flixton Werewolf, and which were fine. And as I told you before, at the very beginning of the story, that guy he'd never heard of it. Then when I continued to dig, and they realised that I weren't just somebody who believed in werewolves depicted in films and silver bullets and the full moon rising and people changing into werewolves, I pointed a few things out to him that I'd found out about the area historically. He opened up and told me that, sure enough, he had heard of the Flixton Werewolf. He did know the stories. His father knew the stories, his grandfather knew the stories, and his relatives before them knew the stories. So that's how hard it is and how deep this story runs. Now, people outside of these villages, in the town of Scarborough, because I've been to their archives at the library, that's quite a bit larger place, they've heard of the stories. But I think that's probably because they have featured in folklore accounts and books from time to time over the years. Odd accounts like the one of it attacking the timber wagon have featured in books throughout the years, and there's a few researchers in this country who've written about the Flixton Werewolf. Without being disrespectful to them, I'm not sure they've ever even been to Flixton. I think most of what everybody's written in the past has just been a copy and paste exercise, which isn't really fair, and it don't do the story justice. I mean, as hard as this story is to swallow, and as hard as people find it to believe that these things are real, if we're going to have people who are supposed to be credited as being the top researchers of this kind of subject in this country and in your country, then at least get off your backsides and actually get to the locations and look into it. I mean, I'm pretty limited. I'm not travelling all over the UK. I've got this on my doorstep and I'm looking into it. People don't have to believe me, but what I'm telling you is my truth and what I've been told. But as for the other researchers, I'm pretty sure they've never even been to Flixton. I think it's just been a copy and paste exercise, Vic.
Finding information on the Flixton Werewolf is very difficult to do. You mentioned how hard it is to get info from people around there on the Flixton Werewolf, so I guess I shouldn't be all that surprised that it is so hard to find info, but after having looked into it, I have got no doubts whatsoever that you are, in fact, the foremost authority on the Flixton Werewolf. You're a modest man, so you're probably going to disagree with that, but that's how I see it.
Well, thank you very much. To be honest, Vic, I never expected to be sat here talking about this. I must admit, I really did not. It's cropped up, and I genuinely thought that after a few pages I'd be putting an end to the Flixton Werewolf, because we have so many big cat sightings around this area also. Large black cats, and we've even had lioness sightings. How that figures, I've just no idea, but the Flixton Werewolf kept cropping up, so I started looking into it, and I'm not going to let it go, Vic, to be honest with you. I'm intrigued. I'm absolutely intrigued. Now, I just hope that the other people that you interview and speak to realise that I am taking it seriously. I'm not trying to be sort of disrespectful to anybody, because I realise that there's some really, really good men in the field who you've spoken to, who know their field craft. I can say I've grown up around farms, but we're in the UK. We don't have that kind of lifestyle and that kind of culture, so it is pretty new to me. But all I can do is keep digging.
Well, I'd say the information that you've amassed is nothing less than impressive, to say the least. It's got to be so hard to try and get information on a topic like this when you're stonewalled by so many people because of the topic like this, but I think it's very impressive, like I said, all the info that you've turned up.
Well, Vic, the topic of UFOs is still sort of looked upon, and people snigger and give you sort of rolled eyes. And I mean, just this Sunday, I don't want to sidetrack too much, but I went to see Stanton Friedman, who some of your listeners will have heard of and know of, the nuclear physicist who spoke of UFOs for a very long time. And I went to see him personally with another chap this Sunday in the UK. When you've got such credible people talking about an unusual subject like UFOs, and the general public still don't sit up and listen, what chance have you got with this, the stories of the Flixton Werewolf here in the UK? It's very difficult, Vic.
Oh, I can only imagine. I guess it's not that much of a stretch to say whereas Bigfoot is our national cryptid, it kind of seems almost like werewolves, i.e. Dogman, are yours.
Perhaps you're right. I mean, once again, Vic, it's a fairly new one on me. I've been looking at it for probably 4 years. The history of the area, if we touch on it, I've looked into that. But to gather these accounts, and it's took this long, is quite a task. And I'm sure there's many more out there. I'm absolutely certain there's more out there. But as I say, all I can do, Vic, is keep digging. Hopefully, after listening to this, I mean, maybe somebody from UK in and around this area might contact you. That would be a plus.
If they do, and if they're willing to have me pass their info on to you so that the two of you can talk about whatever they've got going on, I'd be more than happy to do that. As you've been talking about your research, in fact, I've been kicking around the idea of this particular eyewitness or that particular eyewitness in the UK, possibly putting you into contact with him. I'll reach out to these people that I've got in mind right now, see what they think about that, and take it from there.
Wonderful.
I'd normally ask you to give any closing comments you have, but since you're going to be back for next week's show, I'm just going to go ahead and thank you for coming on the show here and wish you a good night.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure. Thank you, Vic.
Thanks again so much, and I'll talk to you next week.
You're welcome.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter and you'd like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, you can reach me at contact@dogmanencounters.com. I'd love to hear from you.